Welcome back. So, short story is I took a quick vacation. Thought I would go away for a few days, get nice and recharged, take a little break. Hit it hard when I got back, and sadly, I ended up getting sick on the way home. So that kind of kicked my butt, and so now I'm kind of working my way back into reviews with the help of the T, and we'll kind of hit this one. I don't know, maybe in a little more casual way, or at least as long as my voice holds out. So it sounds a bit rough, but we'll work through it. So going back to the first video I did on EM6L, I think what people have begun to notice is that the nozzles are, one, they don't have a lip, and two, they are a little wide. So do remember that. I don't know, I don't really notice it as much because there's no lip. It's not like Con or Zero, which had the bigger lip on a wider nozzle. I think that was more noticeable. This just tends to be maybe a little bit more wide. So that's what I got on the shells anyway, or at least in addition to what I talked about last time. So I do want to start off with... So let's start off with a little continuation of where I left off. And that was these sort of changes between EA500 and EM6L. So I talked about these three yeses, and so let's kind of go back and talk about these in terms of what they really sound like after I listened to it for quite a while. And I think this yes is more of a maybe. I think it was the right move, and I think like most people, I think I just ripped open the box, started listening to it, didn't read their email, but there is an 8mm driver in it, and when you're looking at a curve like this and you're thinking about a 10mm driver and you're like, well, that's quite a bit of sub bass, it's going to be quite a rumbler, you do have to remember it's an 8mm, and the bass quantity isn't really as it looks. So I think I would cross that out and call that more of a maybe. This one is definitely a yes. So this sliding back the pin again, so it's a little more relaxed, a little later, and kind of a little bit lower, not as in your face and as shouty as EA500. So very much 100% yes, that was the right move. It comes across pretty clearly on EM6L, so I will keep that one as a yes. And the treble as well. I think this flat extension through the treble, I think actually does work out quite well. I think that's about as extended as you're going to get at $109 for BAs. You know, I think they actually did a pretty remarkable job of hitting extension without it going too crazy with BA timbre or some other problems that could have happened in the treble area. So maybe that was definitely a yes, and I'll keep that a yes. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of those points before we move on. So EM6L, Flawless Victory. I think this one actually is pretty close. I think SIMGOT did a really good execution of price, right? $109. It's actually an amazingly low price for four drivers, four high quality drivers. The driver count performance, and again, this is one that I talked about quite a few times. It's a lot of times you hear a 4BA or a 3BA or a 2BA, and you kind of question whether it's really better than a 1DD. And I think on this one, I think they did hit the 4BAs, and I think I'm not really left missing a whole lot of resolution or details. I think they kind of nailed that, what it should sound like at 4BAs for the cost. I think they really hit that. Tuning-wise, of course, this is a general, very much likable Harman style, SIMGOT style tuning, so going to appeal to tons of people. And driver quality, again, I think SIMGOT is very good at the driver quality, finding drivers that actually work really well. And again, so I think when you look at how they executed this design, drivers, tuning, cost, accessories, you know, I think they hit a pretty good mark there, and it's going to be really hard to compete with it at that price range. I mean, there'll definitely be sets that are a little different, do things slightly differently, but you know, as far as executing on their vision and their design, I think it is quite well. It's done very, very well. So that being said, I think the hardest part about SIMGOT sets, EA500 included, EW100, EW200, I think all of those including, I think it's really understanding their slant on Harman. SIMGOT's house sound is a little lighter in weight, a little faster, more nimble. It really pushes pinna where there's really no room for any extra brightness or tips from tips or source. They tend to really push it right to the edge of pinna gain. They really want those female vocals to pop out, and I think they do. And like I said, on EM6L, they actually relaxed that a little bit. So EM6L did a great job of really fixing that balance between too much warmth. It's definitely not overly warm, and it's definitely not overly sharp. It's got 4 BAs. It could have been a very sharp analytical set, but no, they actually found a pretty nice middle ground between these two. So one, it doesn't sound harsh and offensive and sharp, but it's also not too warm to the point where you're saying, does this really sound like 4 BAs? You know, I think they did find that middle ground between the two. So what EM6L is not, it's not really a thick, mid-bassy, thick of any kind set. It is faster, lighter weight, nimble, like I said. It is not a banger. It's not super impactful. It is not a detail-chasing analytical set either. It is a very much a middle-of-the-road, perhaps safe is one word to call it, but a kind of middle-of-the-line Harman-style set done with 4 BAs. So is it better than EA500? So EM6L isn't all that far in sound and technicals from EA500, but they really took that in-your-face, that too intense edge off of EA500. So I think people who were turned off by that sound, that in-your-face sound, that borderline harsh, shouty style in EA500, they roll that back a little bit, and it actually ends up sounding maybe a little more V-shaped, just not V-shaped right there in pinna gain. It's sort of moved out a little bit, but they really took that edge off. It's more approachable, and you really push the mids back. Like I said, it has this V kind of edge to it where the mids are pushed back a little bit, and some people are going to call that recessed. We'll talk about that in a second. But you can really turn this one up and hear the BAs extend if you acknowledge what's going on and how that mids are pushed back just a little bit, assuming that you're going to turn it up a little bit to bring them forward. So I will call this one closer to general appealing and a little further from that BA detail beast, right? They really could have really leaned into the BAs, and they didn't on this one. They really made a nice, coherent sounding hybrid, and I can't really argue with what they did there. So as I was just alluding to, the sound and the volume, so SIMGOT's house Harman style, it actually takes on almost a V characteristic where the mids at lower volume definitely are pushed back a little bit. EM6L is more chill than EA500. So lower volume listeners are going to complain it's not big enough, it's not 3D enough, and it's probably not sparkly enough. But you do have to turn this one to the right a bit. There is a minimum volume here where you got to bring the mids forward, and then you'll hear the treble pop into place. It very much has a minimum volume, whereas EA500 didn't really. It had more of a maximum volume because it was a little brighter. I would say EM6L is more of a minimum volume set where you need to get it right into the zone, right into the sweet spot of where the mids sound right. If you need details pushed to hear them, this one isn't your style either. It's got a very relaxed, that linear treble style. There's no really weird peaks and bumps to really push those details, especially at 5K. Just a kind of relaxing glide to the treble, so it's not that style either. SIMGOT did a great job on that intensity control where it can sound hybrid dynamic, but it doesn't have those grab the volume moments, right, that EA500 has. As you're swapping tracks on EA500, you never know if that next track is going to make you, wince a little bit and turn down the volume a little bit. It's just too intense. EA5 or EM6L kind of really smoothed out that whole situation, really cut down the intensity, and okay, I'll kind of admit that it's a more safe tuning that's going to be more general appealing, but that's essentially what they did. So bass-wise, I do think the 8mm is a compliment, but not the driving force here. It's not thick, just meant to add a low end and really match the BAs in speed, and it does that by not going deep. Keep it really punchy and clean. The dynamic driver isn't too slow. The BAs aren't too fast. There's really a nice middle ground with the drivers and how they sound together. I think America by Deuce, I think it's quite passable because you could push enough mid-bass into the driver and you could actually hear it. But generally, I think the mid-bass quantity is on the leaner side. But again, like I said, if you push enough at it, it'll actually sound pretty reasonable and passable. And the variable on this is really a flat source. So at topping, my flat source, very minimal bass. It's a very minimal is probably the perfect word. If you throw a minimal or if you throw a warmer source at it, that will play into the mid bass and it will actually smooth out the mids even more. And again, it's this right on the edge. It will actually lean into your source. It'll mirror kind of what's happening there. So do take that into account. I think I sort of enjoy it either way. I didn't really have a preference either way. I think certain tracks sound fine with a warmer source. Certain tracks I really kind of leaned into the BA technical side and really liked it more of a neutral style, more of a technical, clean. I think that clean, clear side on this set, I think actually works out pretty well. But I don't know. I can see it either way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So for me, the mids on hybrids are usually, does this sound more like BAs or does it sound like more like dynamic drivers? And I think this one takes on more of a dynamic driver approach. There isn't that much BA timbre to it. There's not that much BA edge to it. It's clearly there, and there's actually a really nice technical edge to it, but they didn't really go too far. Like I said, this is a pretty safe version of hybrid tuning. There's enough warmth there to make it sound warm enough. There's enough edge there to sound it edgy enough, so it actually sounds like 4 BAs, like I said. But, I think in the realm of why people buy hybrids, if you're really looking for a BA heavy note definition, super sharp, super fast transients, that's not exactly what EM6L is. It's more of a more technical version of Harman or of those style sets, as opposed to a very flat out, super BA performance style set. It's not really that. So it kind of sounds more like a technical capable dynamic driver. And I think this tone and balance really hits the price point perfectly, right? I don't know how many people would really be spending $100 for a super analytical BA beast of a set. I think those sets exist. I'm not sure that would really fit in with SIMGOT's house sound, with their demographic on who buys their sets. So, I think they just hit the right spot there. Pick this middle of the road. Harman is very likable. Pick something between dynamic driver and BA that's also likable, that sounds very reasonable, that doesn't really have any off spots to it. And I think they just kind of nailed that perfect balance between the two. On the other hand, it doesn't really stand out in any of the technical categories, but it's just well done without having to stand out. I think the resolution is actually quite good. And I think it does hit that Harman upgrade challenge for folks who are looking for something better, but not really too far from something that they already have, right? I think that was the important part of this set, was to give people the option of a 4BA set that sounds kind of similar to what other Harman sets sound like, not far at all, but give them a taste of what balanced armatures can do. And I think they did that. They hit that spot pretty well. So a track like Lady Gaga Shallow, it really shows off most of the fundamentals of what the BAs and resolution and the decays and the attacks and what all that stuff kind of sounds like on here. And it's all very much in line with what you're expecting on this middle of the road tuning. They didn't really over brighten it, so you're missing the decay. They didn't really truncate it. I think they just did a very reasonable job, very nice execution on the balanced armatures. But it really tells you what changed. You can actually hear what changed from the EA500 to the EM6L. So Bradley Cooper's voice, it kind of sounds a little 8mm shallower, right? Again, I think the 8mm, I think, is going to throw off some people. And I do kind of point back to, if it really throws you off, try a different source, and a warmer source at that. It kind of sounds a little bit shallower, and I think a lot of chi-fi sets all have, especially in Harman, have that male vocal problem where they just kind of a little shallower and a little thinner. But then in-your-face intensity of EA500 is definitely relaxed to the point where the stage sounds better on EM6L, and less intense, more natural, less congested on busy parts. For me, that lower volume, it can sound a little bit more recessed, but if you raise the volume, everything can kind of just sound just right, covering more high energy parts. But yeah, for me, I think the stage just kind of falls into place on EM6L at the right volume. And I understand that people are going to say it sounds a little recessed because it can at lower volume, but you just got to raise it a little bit, hear the mids fall into place where they should be, and you end up with a really nice kind of upper range, lower range balance on a set where the stage has enough height from the treble because there's nice extension there. And I think that was one of those tracks that actually I'd actually prefer on EM6L than I did on EA500, and I went back and forth on it. I think it's just too intense on EA500. The warmer source smooths that resolution, so if you're really into hearing the resolution and the details, I do think a warmer source definitely smooth that over. Flat for me was definitely more transparent, cleaner for those looking for more details. And it would also vary more on that, on those note definitions and layering and imaging. I tended, like I said, I went back and forth on this, and I think there are certain tracks, and this is probably one of them, where I think topping this one actually better because it's just cleaner and there's more detail there, there's more resolution there. It's not smoothing anything over. But you know, if I was listening to more bass heavy tracks, then I would definitely go with the warmer one. But EM6L, you can definitely go back and forth, and I don't have a problem with that. So for treble, for me, like I would say nothing really pops out of place. It looks kind of like the graph does. You've got this kind of linear slant down. There isn't really any peaks here. It's just kind of a slight variations, and depending on how you measure it, it's even more linear. But yeah, there's not really any big holes or gaps or peaks or weird things that are going to hit you in the ear where they shouldn't hit you in the ear or make you raise an eyebrow. I think they just did a very nice, safe version of treble tuning, especially on a balanced armature. I think they actually did, the extension is actually pretty good, especially at the price point. That lower treble pinna point pushed back a little bit, drops the energy from EA500, like I said, but a really nice glide through the upper treble. I think they avoided fatigue, most BA timbre, and really a host of other budget consistency problems that you see in other sets, especially with balanced armatures. It's just, treble is the make or break thing, and I think they did a very reasonable, solid, safe job at it, and I can't really fault them for that. You can say that it's not the most airy thing, and it doesn't have super detail in the treble, but what it does do, how nothing pops out of place, and it could play almost any playlist. I think they did that pretty much a solid, and it's actually done quite well. Also, where the 8mm is a bonus, there's just not enough presence to mask the upper treble. So if you're really into mid-bass, masking your airiness, this one actually works in your favor because there's not a whole lot of mid-bass there. So you don't need a ton of upper treble air in the frequency response to hear it. It's just there. You just got to listen to it. It's the stage is sort of a dead giveaway of the air is actually there. It's just not pushed in your face. So flat sources, definitely okay, but avoid bright ones. I think flat is good. Bright is not so good on this one. Again, it's going to play into the lack of mid-bass, and it's going to pop something out of place in the treble. There's no room for extra brightness when paired against the 8mm, right? The 8mm doesn't have enough presence to really balance against any more brightness than is already there. So warmer source might reduce the air. I think that was kind of a maybe. I think it's still fine. But definitely there is a delicate balance here in the treble, so definitely try them all. Like everything else, there's just this tight balance between the amount of mid-bass here. This level is kind of straight there, drop. There isn't really a bump there to really focus your attention on the air. It's there. It's just not pushed in your face. They're not pushing 5K in your face. Everything is there and presented in a natural way. But if you throw too much mid-bass at it, it would have covered up some of that. So very, very nice, delicate balancing act tuning-wise that they did there to get all that to sound right. So stage EM6L kind of relaxed to the point where you don't need to knock it back to get the depth and enough low end to feel more 3D. And I think that was one harder part of EA500 is especially on the more pinna heavy areas, it can actually flatten out and not sound as stagey as it really should. And I think EM6L can really fight with the EA500 on that, especially if you hit it right in that pinna area. And just relaxing it just a little bit, whether that sub bass adds a little bit to the low end to catch that on your tracks. But I think these two together ended up with a quite nice sort of immersive stage for me. I don't know if everyone else will buy into that, but I actually thought it actually worked pretty well. And especially when you compare it against EA500 and how bright, and tracks that really hit that one hard, that one really flattens out pretty quickly. So again, that is what I got on EM6L. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.